June 4, 1942. The skies above Midway Island. Lieutenant Commander John Thach pushed his F4F Wildcat into a steep banking turn, his wingman following 300 feet off his port side. The morning sun reflected off the Pacific Ocean 20,000 feet below, creating a brilliant canvas of blue that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. But Thach's attention was focused entirely on the 4 Japanese Zeros diving toward his formation, their sleek profiles cutting through the morning air like silver arrows. Each Zero bore the distinctive red hinomaru marking on its fuselage, symbols of an air force that had dominated every engagement since Pearl Harbor 7 months earlier. Every tactical manual in the United States Navy said the same thing. When facing the legendary Zero in a turning fight, you're already dead. The Mitsubishi A6M could turn inside any American fighter at virtually any speed, a performance advantage that had proven fatal to hundreds of Allied pilots who had attempted traditional dogfighting tactics. The Zero's empty weight of just 3,700 pounds gave it a power-to-weight ratio that no American fighter could match. Its wing loading of less than 16 pounds per square foot allowed turning performance that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Japanese pilots exploited these advantages with ruthless efficiency, maneuvering into firing positions that left their opponents with no effective defensive options. The Japanese pilots knew it too. They had spent months perfecting their craft over China, perfecting maneuvers that had made them the most feared fighter pilots in the Pacific. The lead pilot of the attacking formation had personally shot down 11 Chinese fighters and 2 American P-40 Warhawks during the Philippines campaign. His wingmen were equally experienced, veterans of the carrier strikes that had devastated Pearl Harbor and supported the rapid Japanese conquest of Southeast Asia. These were not novice pilots learning their trade in combat, but skilled professionals at the peak of their tactical abilities, flying the most maneuverable fighter aircraft in the world. As the lead Zero closed to firing range, its pilot was already calculating the deflection angle for an easy kill. The American Wildcat was predictable, its performance limitations well documented through months of combat analysis. Japanese intelligence reports had detailed every weakness of the F4F, from its sluggish rate of roll to its inferior climb rate. The tactical situation offered every advantage to the attacking Zeros. They held altitude, speed, and numerical superiority against an American formation that appeared isolated and vulnerable. By every calculation of aerial combat doctrine developed over 3 years of warfare, the engagement should end with 4 destroyed American fighters and minimal risk to the attacking Japanese formation. But Lieutenant Commander Thach wasn't trying to outturn the Tau Zero. He was executing a maneuver he had sketched on a restaurant napkin 6 months earlier during a frustrated evening in San Diego, a tactical innovation that would transform every assumption the Japanese had made about American fighter capabilities. The defensive pattern he had developed during countless hours of analysis represented a fundamental reimagining of fighter combat doctrine, one that accepted American equipment limitations and worked within those constraints to create tactical advantages through coordination rather than individual performance. The Zero pilots were about to discover that numerical superiority means nothing when you're flying into a carefully designed crossfire. The fundamental equation of fighter combat that had favored Japanese aircraft and pilot skill was about to be rewritten by an American innovation that required no superior technology, only disciplined teamwork and perfect timing. The first tracer rounds from the lead Zero passed 20 feet above Thach's canopy, close enough that he could see the phosphorescent glow against the blue Pacific sky. Lieutenant Commander John Thach had been expecting this moment since January, when intelligence reports confirmed what every Navy pilot already knew through bitter experience. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was superior to the F4F Wildcat in virtually every measurable category. It could climb faster, turn tighter, and accelerate more quickly than any fighter the United States had in operational service. The performance gap was not marginal, but decisive. In head-to-head comparisons conducted at the Naval Air Test Center, the Zero demonstrated a rate of climb 30% better than the Wildcat at combat altitudes. Its turning radius at 250 knots was nearly 40% tighter than the American fighter could manage without stalling. Most critically, the Zero maintained energy in sustained turning fights, while the heavier Wildcat bled airspeed with every maneuver, creating conditions where Japanese pilots could dictate the terms of engagement with near impunity. Japanese pilots trained in these aircraft had accumulated hundreds of combat hours over China and Southeast Asia, creating a cadre of experienced aviators whose skill level exceeded anything American training programs were producing. The average Japanese Navy fighter pilot, arriving at combat units in early 1942, possessed over 800 hours of total flight time and had completed advanced tactical training that emphasized aggressive individual combat. By comparison, American replacement pilots were arriving at fleet squadrons with less than 300 total hours and minimal gunnery training. The experience gap compounded the equipment disadvantage, creating conditions where Japanese fighters were achieving kill ratios exceeding 10-1 in some early war engagements. Thach gripped his control stick and began the first movement of the defensive weave he had developed. During months of frustrated analysis at Naval Air Station San Diego, his wingman, Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare, was already responding to the visual signal, turning hard to port as Thach broke starboard. The coordination between the two pilots reflected hours of practice flights conducted over the California coast, where they had refined the timing and positioning that made the defensive pattern effective. O'Hare was one of the few pilots Thach trusted completely to execute the maneuver under combat conditions, a trust built through shared training experiences and mutual understanding of the tactical concept underlying the weave. The two Wildcats began crossing paths in a scissors maneuver that looked chaotic, but was actually a precisely choreographed dance designed to create an impossible tactical problem for any pursuing aircraft. Each pilot maintained situational awareness of his partner's position through peripheral vision and practiced timing, never losing focus on the threat environment while executing the coordinated turns. The defensive weave required absolute trust between wingmen, as each pilot was deliberately exposing himself to attack while maneuvering to protect his partner. Any failure in coordination or timing would leave both aircraft vulnerable to the concentrated fire of attacking Japanese fighters. The lead Zero pilot followed Thach through his turn, exactly as predicted. Japanese fighter doctrine emphasized aggressive pursuit and quick kills, tactics that had proven devastatingly effective against Chinese and British aircraft throughout the early war period. The pilot had shot down 7 Allied planes in the previous 4 months, and saw no reason to expect this encounter would be any different. His training had instilled absolute confidence in the superiority of Japanese fighter capabilities and tactical methods. The Zero's performance advantages had proven decisive in every engagement he had experienced, from the skies over Nanking to the chaotic air battles during the invasion of the Dutch East Indies. American fighters had consistently failed to mount effective resistance against Zero formations, and intelligence briefings had assured Japanese pilots that the Americans lacked both the aircraft and the tactical skill necessary to challenge Japanese air superiority. Reports from returning pilots described American formations that fragmented under pressure, with individual aircraft attempting to escape rather than mounting coordinated defensive efforts. The psychological assessments prepared by Japanese intelligence officers characterized American pilots as technically competent but lacking the warrior spirit and tactical discipline necessary for successful fighter combat. These reports had shaped Japanese tactical planning and influenced the aggressive doctrine that sent Zero formations hunting for combat rather than maintaining defensive postures. The lead pilot's focus narrowed to his gun sight as he tracked Thach's Wildcat through the turn, his thumb moving toward the cannon firing button. The 20mm shells loaded in his wing-mounted cannons would shred the American fighter's structure with a single good burst. He had performed this maneuver successfully dozens of times, closing to point-blank range where even modest gunnery skills guaranteed lethal hits. The mechanical reliability of his aircraft and the proven effectiveness of his weapons gave him absolute confidence in the outcome of this engagement. Every element of the tactical situation favored his success, from his altitude advantage to his aircraft's superior performance in turning combat. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lieutenant Edward O'Hare watched through his gun sight as the Zero pursuing Thach entered his firing solution. The Japanese pilot was so focused on his primary target that he had lost situational awareness of the second American fighter that was now positioned perfectly on his 6 o'clock. O'Hare's 650 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously, their combined rate of fire delivering over 3,000 rounds per minute into the Zero's unarmored fuel tanks. The Japanese fighter exploded in a ball of orange flame, breaking apart before its pilot could react to the threat he had never seen coming. 3 more Zeros were diving toward the American formation, their pilots confident that they could overwhelm the 2 remaining Wildcats through superior numbers and aircraft performance. The tactical situation should have favored the Japanese in every respect. They possessed a 4-2 numerical advantage, were flying superior aircraft, and were attacking from an altitude advantage that gave them both speed and position. American fighter doctrine up to this point had emphasized individual dogfighting skills, with pilots expected to engage enemy aircraft in one-on-one combat that showcased pilot ability and aircraft performance. But Thach had recognized during his analysis that this approach played directly into Japanese strengths, forcing American pilots to fight a battle where every advantage belonged to the enemy. The Thach weave eliminated the individual dogfight entirely, transforming fighter combat into a coordinated team effort where 2 aircraft working together could defeat superior numbers of better-performing fighters. The key was that neither American pilot tried to outturn the Zero. Instead, they created a situation where pursuing any single Wildcat meant flying into the guns of the other. Commander Minoru Genda watched the tactical situation developing from the bridge of the carrier Akagi, monitoring radio reports from fighter formations engaging American aircraft over Midway. The early reports had been encouraging. Japanese fighters were encountering the expected resistance from obsolete American aircraft that posed little threat to experienced Zero pilots. But something unexpected was occurring in one sector, where American F4F Wildcats were destroying Zeros at an impossible rate. Initial reports suggested equipment malfunction or pilot error, but as more detailed information filtered back from the combat area, a disturbing pattern emerged. American fighters were employing a defensive tactic that Japanese pilots had never encountered, one that negated the performance advantages that made the Zero dominant in traditional dogfighting. Genda had personally supervised the development of Japanese naval fighter doctrine, emphasizing aggressive tactics that exploited the Zero's exceptional maneuverability. His pilots had trained for months on techniques that allowed them to outmaneuver any opponent, closing to point-blank range where their 20mm cannons could deliver devastating fire. The success of these tactics throughout the China campaign and the opening months of the Pacific War had confirmed the fundamental soundness of Japanese fighter doctrine. Yet somehow, American pilots flying inferior aircraft were achieving results that should have been impossible, according to every tactical assessment the Japanese Naval Air Staff had prepared. The second wave of Zeros attacking Thach's formation split into 2 elements, attempting to attack from multiple angles simultaneously. This was standard Japanese fighter tactics, using numerical superiority to overwhelm defensive formations and create opportunities for individual pilots to demonstrate their superior skill. Lieutenant Junior Grade William Leonard, flying as Thach's second section leader, initiated his own weave with his wingman, creating a second defensive pattern that covered the original pair. 4 American Wildcats were now weaving in coordinated scissors turns that created interlocking fields of fire covering every approach angle. The Japanese pilots found themselves in a tactical nightmare. Pursuing a single Wildcat meant exposing themselves to fire from at least one other American fighter. The traditional advantage of superior maneuverability became irrelevant when there was no safe attack angle. Zeros that attempted high-speed slashing attacks through the formation were met with concentrated machine gun fire that their unarmored fuel systems could not survive. The tactical innovation that Thach had developed transformed the fundamental equation of fighter combat in the Pacific. Japanese pilot Saburo Sakai had survived combat over China, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, accumulating 64 confirmed kills that made him one of the most experienced fighter pilots in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had encountered every type of Allied aircraft in operational service and had developed instinctive tactical responses that had kept him alive through hundreds of combat missions. But as he dove toward the American formation weaving below him, his combat experience provided no useful reference for what he was witnessing. The Wildcats were not attempting to dogfight or flee, but were executing a defensive pattern that created crossing firing solutions covering every attack vector. Sakai pulled out of his dive and circled at a safe distance, analyzing the tactical problem. Every approach angle he calculated led his fighter directly into American guns. The maneuver appeared simple, just two aircraft turning toward each other repeatedly. But the timing and coordination required to maintain effective coverage suggested extensive training and predetermined signals. American pilots had somehow developed a defensive tactic that negated Japanese advantages in aircraft performance and individual pilot skill. The realization was profoundly disturbing to a pilot who had built his reputation on superior tactical ability. Thach's radio crackled with reports from other American fighter formations that had begun implementing the weave after observing its effectiveness. The tactical innovation was spreading across the battlefield in real time, as pilots recognized that coordinated defensive flying provided better survival odds than traditional dogfighting. Japanese fighter sweeps that should have destroyed American air cover were instead suffering unexpected casualties, as F4F formations refused to engage in turning fights and instead maintained defensive patterns that created impossible tactical problems. The Battle of Midway was becoming a test case for a fundamental shift in fighter tactics that would influence aerial combat doctrine for the remainder of the war. Commander Genda received damage reports from returning Zero pilots whose aircraft had been hit by American machine gun fire while attempting to break up the defensive formations. The casualties were higher than any previous engagement with American fighters, and multiple pilots reported that traditional Japanese tactics were proving ineffective against the coordinated defensive flying. The tactical advantage that Japanese fighters had enjoyed throughout the early war period was being negated by an American innovation that required no superior equipment, only coordinated teamwork and disciplined execution. Lieutenant Commander Thach watched another Zero explode under fire from his wingman's guns, the third kill in less than 10 minutes of combat. His formation remained intact despite repeated Japanese attacks, and American casualties were significantly lower than in any previous engagement with Zero fighters. The Thach weave had proven itself under combat conditions, demonstrating that tactical innovation could overcome equipment disadvantages when properly executed. The Japanese pilots breaking off their attacks were retreating not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they had encountered a tactical problem their training had not prepared them to solve. The fundamental assumption underlying Japanese fighter doctrine, that superior aircraft performance and pilot skill would guarantee victory, was being challenged by an American approach that emphasized teamwork over individual capability. The implications extended far beyond this single engagement to reshape fighter tactics throughout the Pacific theater. The morning sun climbed higher over Midway as the air battle continued across multiple sectors. Japanese fighter formations that had expected to achieve air superiority within the first hour of combat were instead engaged in frustrating encounters with American defensive formations that refused to fight according to expected patterns. Zero pilots who had accumulated impressive kill records against Chinese and British aircraft found themselves unable to break up the coordinated American defensive tactics. Radio communications between Japanese formations revealed growing frustration as experienced pilots reported that traditional attack methods were resulting in unacceptable casualties without achieving the expected destruction of American air cover. The tactical situation was deteriorating in ways that Japanese planners had not anticipated when they designed the Midway operation. Lieutenant William Leonard's formation destroyed 2 more Zeros, attempting to penetrate the defensive weave from different angles simultaneously. The Japanese pilots had tried to coordinate their attacks to overwhelm the American defensive pattern, but the timing required for such tactics was being disrupted by the constant turning of the Wildcat formations. Every attack that failed to achieve immediate results forced the Zeros to break off and attempt repositioning, creating opportunities for other American fighters to engage them while they were vulnerable. The defensive weave was not just protecting individual aircraft, but was creating offensive opportunities that allowed numerically inferior American formations to achieve favorable exchange ratios. Japanese numerical superiority was becoming a liability as multiple Zeros, attempting to attack the same formation, found themselves interfering with each other's firing solutions, while American defensive patterns created clear lanes of fire for coordinated responses. Commander Genda made the decision to recall fighter formations from offensive sweeps and reassign them to defensive combat air patrol over the Japanese carrier task force. The American defensive tactics had proven too effective to permit continued offensive operations without unacceptable fighter losses. The recall order represented a significant tactical adjustment forced by American innovations that Japanese planning had not anticipated. Fighter protection for Japanese bombers attacking Midway would be reduced, creating vulnerabilities that American defenders could exploit. The broader implications for Japanese offensive operations were becoming apparent as the tactical balance shifted in unexpected ways. The air superiority that Japanese planners had assumed would be achieved quickly and maintained throughout the operation was instead being contested by American fighters employing tactics that negated Japanese advantages. The fundamental assumptions underlying the Midway operational plan were being challenged by tactical innovations that Japanese intelligence had not detected during pre-operation planning. Thach led his formation back toward Midway to rearm and refuel, maintaining defensive weave patterns even during the return flight. Japanese fighters shadowing the American formation attempted several half-hearted attacks, but broke off when confronted with the coordinated defensive response. The psychological impact of the tactical innovation was becoming apparent as Japanese pilots showed increasing reluctance to press attacks against formations employing the weave. The traditional aggressive Japanese fighter doctrine was being tempered by practical recognition that attacks against coordinated American defensive patterns resulted in casualties without achieving tactical objectives. Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare landed his Wildcat on Midway's Coral runway and began the immediate turnaround procedures necessary to return to combat as quickly as possible. His aircraft had expended most of its ammunition, destroying 3 Japanese fighters, but the airframe was undamaged and mechanically sound. The ground crew swarmed over the fighter, reloading ammunition cans and topping off fuel tanks, while O'Hare provided a rapid debriefing to intelligence officers documenting the effectiveness of the Thach weave in actual combat conditions. The tactical innovation that Lieutenant Commander Thach had developed during months of theoretical analysis in California was now being validated under combat conditions that would shape fighter doctrine for the remainder of the Pacific War. The defensive weave had transformed the tactical balance in fighter combat, providing American pilots with a method for surviving encounters with superior Japanese aircraft, achieving favorable exchange ratios despite equipment disadvantages. The implications extended beyond individual engagements to influence broader strategic planning, as American commanders recognized that tactical innovation could compensate for temporary equipment shortfalls, while industrial production provided improved fighter aircraft. The Battle of Midway was demonstrating that warfare in the Pacific would be determined not just by equipment, performance, and pilot skill, but by tactical doctrines that could adapt to evolving combat conditions and exploit enemy weaknesses through innovative thinking. Saburo Sakai returned to the carrier Hiryu, with his Zero showing battle damage from a deflection shot that had come closer than any American fire he had experienced in 2 years of combat operations. The fighter's aluminum skin bore scars from .50 caliber rounds that had passed within feet of his cockpit, evidence of how dramatically the tactical situation had changed during a single morning of combat. As he climbed down from his aircraft, Sakai found himself surrounded by other pilots whose combat reports contradicted everything Japanese naval aviation had assumed about American fighter capabilities. The maintenance crews examining damaged Zeros were documenting hit patterns that suggested coordinated crossfire from multiple directions, something that should have been impossible against American fighters that Japanese intelligence assessments had described as disorganized and poorly trained. Commander Genda assembled his fighter squadron leaders in the carrier's ready room, demanding detailed explanations for casualty rates that exceeded anything experienced during previous operations against American forces. The reports from experienced pilots like Sakai were consistent and deeply troubling. American fighters were employing a defensive tactic that created interlocking fields of fire covering every attack angle. Japanese pilots attempting to press attacks found themselves flying into concentrated machine gun fire from multiple directions, while their intended targets maneuvered in coordinated patterns that prevented effective pursuit. The tactical advantage that Japanese fighters had enjoyed throughout the early war period was being systematically negated by an American innovation that required no superior technology, only disciplined coordination between pairs of aircraft working as integrated teams. Lieutenant Yamamoto, a veteran of the China campaign with 43 confirmed kills, provided the most disturbing assessment. The American defensive pattern was not a desperate improvisation, but a carefully designed tactical system that suggested extensive training and predetermined coordination procedures. The Wildcat pilots were executing the maneuver with precision that indicated months of practice, maintaining formation discipline even under intense pressure from multiple attacking aircraft. More significantly, the tactic was spreading across the battlefield as other American formations observed its effectiveness and began implementing similar defensive patterns. Japanese fighter doctrine had no prepared response to coordinated defensive flying that eliminated the individual dogfights where superior Japanese pilot skill and aircraft performance could be decisive. The strategic implications were becoming apparent to Genda as he analyzed the tactical reports from the morning's combat operations. Japanese offensive operations over Midway had been designed around the assumption of rapid air superiority achieved through overwhelming fighter performance and pilot skill. Instead, American defensive tactics were creating a contested air environment where Japanese fighters were suffering unexpected casualties while failing to suppress American air defenses. The broader operational plan for Midway had been predicated on Japanese ability to achieve and maintain air superiority throughout the critical phases of the amphibious assault. The failure to neutralize American fighter resistance was creating cascading problems for subsequent phases of the operation. Bomber formations requiring fighter escort were experiencing higher losses than anticipated. Japanese fighters assigned to fleet defense were being diverted to support offensive operations that were consuming ammunition and fuel faster than predicted. The tactical innovation that Lieutenant Commander Thach had developed was influencing strategic outcomes beyond the immediate air combat results. Lieutenant Commander Thach landed his Wildcat after the third combat sortie of the day, his ammunition expended and his fuel gauges reading near empty. The maintenance crews at Midway were working with desperate efficiency to turn around fighters for additional missions, but the tempo of operations was straining logistics capabilities beyond their designed limits. Thach's debriefing to the air group commander provided the first comprehensive assessment of how the defensive weave was performing under sustained combat conditions. American fighter casualties were running at approximately 1/4 the rate of previous engagements with zero formations. Japanese fighters were showing increased reluctance to press attacks when confronted with coordinated defensive patterns. Most significantly, the tactic was being successfully employed by relatively inexperienced pilots who had received only brief instruction on the basic maneuver. The defensive weave did not require exceptional flying skill or extensive combat experience, only the discipline to maintain formation and execute coordinated turns at the proper timing. This meant that American fighter effectiveness could be dramatically improved across the entire pilot population without waiting for individual pilots to accumulate combat experience through survival of multiple engagements. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us and continue producing in-depth content like this. The afternoon combat operations over Midway demonstrated the full extent to which the Thach weave had altered the tactical balance of fighter combat in the Pacific. Japanese fighter sweeps that should have achieved air superiority were instead being fought to a standstill by numerically inferior American formations that refused to engage in traditional dogfighting. Zero pilots who attempted to break up the defensive patterns through aggressive attacks were being shot down at rates that made such tactics unsustainable. The psychological impact on Japanese fighter units was becoming apparent as pilots who had never experienced significant losses against Allied aircraft found themselves facing an American defensive system that their training had not prepared them to counter. Radio communications between Japanese formations revealed increasing frustration and declining morale as the tactical situation continued to deteriorate throughout the afternoon. Commander Genda was forced to acknowledge that American fighters had achieved tactical parity despite flying inferior aircraft, a development that contradicted fundamental assumptions underlying Japanese naval aviation doctrine. Lieutenant William Leonard's formation destroyed 4 additional Zeros during the afternoon engagements, maintaining a defensive weave pattern that survived attacks from multiple directions by superior numbers of Japanese fighters. The young pilot had accumulated more combat experience in 6 hours of fighting than most American aviators gained in months of peacetime training. His tactical understanding of the defensive weave had evolved from mechanical execution of a memorized procedure to intuitive coordination with his wingman that required no verbal communication. The defensive pattern had become second nature, allowing him to focus on identifying tactical opportunities rather than consciously thinking about the basic maneuver. This evolution, from conscious execution to unconscious competence, represented the transformation that combat experience produced in surviving pilots, creating a cadre of tactically sophisticated aviators who could train the next generation of fighter pilots using lessons learned under actual combat conditions. Saburo Sakai attempted one final attack against an American formation during the late afternoon, approaching from high altitude with maximum speed advantage. The tactical setup was optimal according to Japanese fighter doctrine, providing every possible advantage for a successful engagement. But as he dove toward the American formation, the Wildcats immediately began their defensive weave, creating crossing firing solutions that forced him to break off the attack before reaching effective gun range. The American pilots had maintained situational awareness throughout his approach and had initiated their defensive response at precisely the moment that committed him to either breaking off or flying into their coordinated crossfire. Sakai climbed back to altitude and acknowledged what many other Japanese pilots were reluctantly accepting. The Americans had developed a tactical system that negated Japanese advantages and created conditions where pressing an attack resulted in unacceptable risk without corresponding probability of success. The psychological impact of this recognition would influence Japanese fighter tactics throughout the remainder of the war, as pilots who had built their reputations on aggressive individual combat showed increasing caution when confronting coordinated American defensive formations. The sun began to set over Midway as the final combat operations of the day concluded, with American fighters maintaining control over the approaches to the island despite hours of sustained combat against superior numbers of Japanese aircraft. The tactical victory that the Thach weave had enabled was becoming apparent in the broader operational outcomes of the battle. Japanese bomber formations had suffered higher losses than anticipated due to reduced fighter escort effectiveness. American defensive aircraft had survived in sufficient numbers to contest Japanese air operations throughout the critical phases of the battle. Most significantly, the psychological impact on Japanese fighter pilots was undermining the aggressive doctrine that had made them so effective during the opening months of the Pacific War. Commander Genda's after-action assessment acknowledged that American tactical innovations had fundamentally altered the dynamics of fighter combat in ways that Japanese planning had not anticipated. The defensive weave represented more than just a clever tactical trick. It was a systematic approach to fighter combat that transformed numerical and equipment disadvantages into manageable tactical problems through coordinated teamwork. Lieutenant Commander Thach sat in the ready room at Midway, writing preliminary notes for the tactical report he would submit to Naval Air Command in Pearl Harbor. The defensive weave had proven itself under the most demanding combat conditions imaginable, validating the theoretical analysis he had conducted during months of frustrating study in California. But Thach understood that the real significance of the tactic extended beyond his personal vindication to represent a fundamental shift in how American fighter forces would conduct operations for the remainder of the war. The defensive pattern could be taught to relatively inexperienced pilots with minimal training time, providing an immediate improvement in combat effectiveness across the entire fighter force. The coordination required between wingmen could be practiced in peacetime conditions without exposing pilots to combat risk. Most importantly, the tactic transformed fighter combat from an individual test of pilot skill into a team effort, where coordinated execution was more valuable than exceptional individual ability. This democratization of fighter effectiveness would prove decisive, as American training programs began producing large numbers of adequately trained pilots who could achieve tactically significant results through disciplined execution of coordinated tactics. The Battle of Midway concluded with American forces maintaining control of the island and Japanese carrier operations disrupted by losses that exceeded pre-operation estimates. The fighter combat that had raged throughout June 4th had contributed to broader operational failures that would mark Midway as a turning point in the Pacific War. But beyond the immediate strategic outcomes, the tactical innovations demonstrated during the air battles would reshape fighter doctrine and training programs throughout the American military establishment. The Thach Weave had proven that tactical innovation could overcome equipment disadvantages and create conditions for success, even when facing numerically superior forces flying better aircraft. This lesson would influence American military thinking far beyond the specific application of defensive fighter tactics to affect broader approaches to tactical problem-solving and doctrinal development. Commander Genda submitted his final assessment of the Midway operation to Admiral Yamamoto aboard the battleship Yamato, acknowledging that American fighter resistance had proven far more effective than Japanese intelligence estimates had predicted. The defensive tactics employed by American pilots had negated Japanese advantages in aircraft performance and pilot experience, creating tactical conditions that made achievement of air superiority impossible within the operational timeline required for successful amphibious assault. The report recommended fundamental reassessment of Japanese fighter doctrine and development of new tactics specifically designed to counter the coordinated defensive flying that American formations were now employing throughout the Pacific theater. But Genda recognized that such doctrinal evolution would require months of development and training, during which time American forces would continue to employ tactics that had already proven their effectiveness under combat conditions. The tactical initiative had shifted to the Americans in ways that would be difficult to reverse through conventional doctrinal responses. Japanese naval aviation would spend the remainder of 1942 attempting to develop counter-tactics to the Thach Weave, but the fundamental problem remained unsolvable within the constraints of existing Japanese fighter doctrine. The aggressive individual combat that had made Zero pilots so effective during the early war period was incompatible with the disciplined coordination required to break up American defensive formations. Attempts to develop tactics using multiple Zeros attacking simultaneously from different angles required levels of coordination and communication that Japanese training programs had not emphasized. The technological limitations of Japanese radio equipment made real-time coordination between multiple aircraft difficult under combat conditions. Most significantly, the casualty rates experienced by Japanese fighter units during engagements with American defensive formations were creating an experience gap that would only widen as the war continued. American pilots were surviving their early combat encounters at higher rates due to the protection provided by defensive weave tactics, allowing them to accumulate combat experience that made them increasingly effective. Japanese pilots were suffering higher casualty rates that were eliminating experienced aviators faster than training programs could replace them with equally skilled personnel. Lieutenant Commander Thach received orders to return to Pearl Harbor for reassignment to a training command where he would be responsible for teaching the defensive weave to fighter squadrons throughout the Pacific Fleet. His tactic innovation was being institutionalized through formal training programs that would ensure every American fighter pilot learned the coordinated defensive flying techniques that had proven so effective at Midway. The standardization of the tactic across multiple squadrons would create uniform defensive capabilities that Japanese forces would encounter wherever they engaged American fighters. The psychological impact on Japanese pilot morale would be cumulative, as repeated encounters with the defensive weave reinforced the lesson that aggressive attacks against American formations resulted in unacceptable casualties without achieving tactical objectives. Lieutenant William Leonard received promotion to lieutenant and assignment as a flight instructor at Naval Air Station Pensacola, where he would train the next generation of Navy fighter pilots using combat lessons learned during the Battle of Midway. His personal evolution from inexperienced replacement pilot to combat veteran had occurred over a single day of intensive air combat, but the tactical knowledge he had gained would be passed on to hundreds of student pilots who would carry those lessons throughout the Pacific War. The maintenance crews at Midway spent the evening of June 4th repairing battle-damaged Wildcats and preparing aircraft for continued operations the following day. The intensity of the day's air combat had strained logistics capabilities and maintenance resources beyond their designed limits, but American organizational systems had proven capable of sustaining high-tempo operations through efficient use of available resources. The contrast with Japanese logistics capabilities was becoming apparent as the battle continued into its second day. American forces possessed the organizational infrastructure and supply reserves necessary to maintain sustained combat operations, while Japanese forces were beginning to experience ammunition and fuel shortages that limited their operational flexibility. The industrial and logistical advantages that would ultimately determine the outcome of the Pacific War were already influencing tactical outcomes at Midway through differences in sustainability and operational tempo. Saburo Sakai returned to Japan 3 months after Midway with orders to serve as an instructor pilot at the fighter training school in Yokosuka. His combat experience against American defensive tactics made him one of the few Japanese aviators qualified to teach counter-tactics to the defensive weave. But during his months as an instructor, Sakai came to recognize that the fundamental problem was not tactical, but systemic. Japanese training programs emphasized individual skill and aggressive combat, producing excellent pilots who excelled at one-on-one dogfighting. American training was increasingly focused on team coordination and disciplined execution of predetermined tactics, producing adequately skilled pilots who achieved superior results through coordinated effort. The philosophical difference between these approaches reflected broader cultural and organizational distinctions that would influence combat effectiveness throughout the war. Japanese excellence in individual performance could not compensate for American superiority in organizational systems and coordinated operations. The tactical innovation that Lieutenant Commander Thach had developed during 6 months of theoretical analysis transformed fighter combat throughout the Pacific Theater during the 18 months following Midway. American fighter squadrons employed variations of the defensive weave in every major engagement, from Guadalcanal to the Philippine Sea, achieving exchange ratios that steadily improved as pilot experience and aircraft quality increased. The coordinated defensive tactics that had proven so effective at Midway were refined and adapted for different tactical situations, creating a comprehensive doctrine for fighter operations that emphasized teamwork over individual performance. At Guadalcanal in August 1942, Marine fighter squadrons flying F4F Wildcats from Henderson Field employed the Thach weave to defend the island against numerically superior Japanese air attacks launched from Rabaul. The Marine pilots, many of whom were recent graduates of flight training with minimal combat experience, achieved survival rates that exceeded pre-war predictions by significant margins. The defensive tactics allowed them to survive their initial combat encounters and accumulate the experience necessary to become effective fighter pilots. By October 1942, the Marine squadrons at Guadalcanal were achieving favorable exchange ratios against Japanese Zero formations, despite continuing to fly the technically inferior Wildcat. The tactical innovation had fundamentally altered the balance of fighter combat in the South Pacific. Japanese fighter units that had dominated air combat during the opening months of the war found themselves unable to achieve air superiority against American formations that employed coordinated defensive tactics. The casualty rates among Japanese fighter pilots accelerated throughout 1943 and 44, creating an experience deficit that Japanese training programs could not overcome. The pre-war training system that had produced the highly skilled pilots of early 1942 had been designed for peacetime conditions and could not scale to meet wartime casualty rates. As experienced pilots were killed in combat, they were replaced by inadequately trained personnel who lacked the hundreds of flight hours and advanced tactical training that had made Japanese naval aviation so effective during the opening campaigns. By mid-1944, the average experience level of Japanese fighter pilots had declined to the point where they were tactically ineffective, even when flying superior aircraft like the Zero. American intelligence assessments documented this decline through analysis of combat reports and interrogations of captured Japanese pilots. The newest Japanese pilots arriving at combat units possessed less than 100 hours of total flight time and had received only basic instruction in fighter tactics. When these inexperienced pilots encountered American formations employing the Thach weave and flying improved aircraft like the F4F Wildcat, the results were devastatingly one-sided. The tactical and training advantages that American forces had developed since Midway were creating conditions for air superiority that Japanese forces could no longer effectively contest. The F4F Wildcat that entered service in late 1943 incorporated performance improvements that eliminated many of the equipment disadvantages American pilots had faced at Midway, but the tactical doctrines developed around the Thach weave remained central to Navy fighter operations. The Hellcat's more powerful engine and improved aerodynamics gave it performance that matched or exceeded the Zero in most flight regimes, finally providing American pilots with an aircraft that could compete on equal terms with Japanese fighters. But the tactical advantage created by coordinated defensive flying remained relevant even with improved equipment, as the Thach weave principles were adapted to offensive tactics that allowed American formations to maintain mutual support while conducting aggressive sweeps against Japanese air bases. The combination of improved aircraft and refined tactics created conditions for American air superiority that Japanese forces could no longer contest effectively. Navy fighter squadrons operating from Essex-class carriers employed variations of the Thach weave that had evolved from purely defensive patterns into flexible tactical systems applicable to both offensive and defensive operations. The fundamental principle of coordinated mutual support between pairs of fighters remained constant, but the specific maneuvers were adapted for different tactical situations, ranging from escort missions to fighter sweeps over enemy territory. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944 demonstrated the cumulative impact of tactical innovations and industrial advantages that had been developing since Midway. American fighters destroyed over 400 Japanese aircraft in a single day's combat, losses that Japanese naval aviation could not replace with equivalently trained personnel. The battle occurred during the American invasion of Saipan, when Japanese carrier-based aircraft launched massive strikes against the American fleet in an attempt to disrupt the amphibious operations. American fighter direction officers aboard the carriers coordinated defensive responses that positioned F4F Wildcat formations to intercept the incoming Japanese strikes at optimal altitudes and positions. The Japanese formations attacking the American fleet included many pilots with minimal combat experience, flying into a defensive system that combined radar early warning, coordinated fighter direction, and tactical formations based on the principles Thach had developed 2 years earlier. The American fighters employed the defensive weave when necessary to protect damaged aircraft or when surprised by Japanese attacks from favorable positions, but increasingly used offensive variations of the coordinated tactics to conduct systematic destruction of enemy formations. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots was devastating, as they witnessed the complete failure of their offensive against American defenses that seemed impenetrable. The tactical dominance that the defensive weave had initiated at Midway had evolved into complete American control of the air throughout the Pacific theater. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from the losses suffered during the Marianas Campaign, and subsequent operations increasingly relied on desperate kamikaze tactics that reflected the abandonment of conventional fighter combat doctrine. The evolution from defensive innovation to overwhelming offensive superiority had occurred over a span of just 24 months, demonstrating how rapidly tactical advantages could be exploited when supported by superior industrial production and training systems. Lieutenant Commander John Thach received promotion to captain and assignment to Pacific Fleet Headquarters, where his tactical expertise influenced fighter doctrine development throughout the final 2 years of the war. His responsibilities expanded beyond simple tactical instruction to include comprehensive analysis of fighter combat results and development of new tactical concepts based on emerging technologies and evolving Japanese defense strategies. Thach worked closely with intelligence analysts to understand how Japanese forces were adapting to American tactical innovations, ensuring that Navy fighter doctrine continued to evolve faster than enemy countermeasures could be developed and implemented. The defensive weave that bore his name had become standard procedure taught to every American fighter pilot, institutionalized through training programs and tactical manuals that ensured consistent execution across multiple squadrons and air groups. The Naval Air Training Command incorporated the Thach weave into basic fighter tactics courses, ensuring that every pilot graduated with thorough understanding of coordinated defensive flying principles. Training films demonstrated the proper execution of the maneuver, using gun camera footage from actual combat to illustrate both successful applications and common errors that reduced tactical effectiveness. The standardization of the tactic across the entire Navy fighter force created uniform capabilities that could be assumed by tactical planners when developing operational plans. The tactical innovation had saved thousands of American lives by providing fighter pilots with débelays, effective defensive capabilities against superior Japanese aircraft during the critical period when American industrial production was developing improved fighters. Statistical analysis conducted by Navy operational research teams documented that pilot survival rates in units employing the Thach weave were approximately 60% higher than in units that had not adopted the coordinated defense tactics. The improved survival rates during initial combat experiences allowed pilots to accumulate the tactical knowledge and combat reflexes necessary for long-term effectiveness, creating a virtuous cycle where surviving pilots became progressively more capable while training the next generation of aviators. More significantly, the defensive weave had demonstrated that tactical innovation could overcome temporary equipment disadvantages and create conditions for success, even when facing numerically superior forces. This lesson influenced American military thinking far beyond fighter aviation to affect approaches to tactical problem-solving throughout the armed forces. The recognition that coordinated teamwork could compensate for individual equipment or skill disadvantages became central to American military doctrine, influencing everything from infantry tactics to naval surface warfare. The philosophical shift from emphasis on individual performance to focus on coordinated team operations represented a fundamental change in American military culture that would persist long after the specific tactical circumstances that prompted the Thach weave had been superseded by technological advances. Thach continued his naval career after the war, eventually rising to the rank of admiral and commanding carrier divisions during the Cold War period. His tactical innovations at Midway remained his most significant contribution to naval aviation, but his broader influence on doctrinal development and training systems shaped Navy fighter operations for decades. The principles underlying the Thach weave, mutual support through coordinated maneuvering and creation of crossfire opportunities through disciplined teamwork, became foundational concepts in jet-age fighter tactics, even as the specific aircraft and weapons systems evolved beyond recognition from the F4F Wildcats that had first employed the defensive pattern over Midway. The legacy of the tactical innovation extended beyond individual careers or specific combat results to influence how military organizations approached the problem of technological disadvantage and numerical inferiority. The Thach weave demonstrated that creative tactical thinking could identify solutions to seemingly impossible military problems, providing hope and practical methods for forces facing superior opponents. This lesson proved relevant in conflicts far removed from the Pacific War, as military forces confronting technologically superior adversaries studied the principles underlying Thach's innovation and developed their own coordinated tactics designed to negate enemy advantages through disciplined teamwork and innovative thinking. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.